Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Solana, and we're going to be looking at its Bitcoin pair and making the comparisons to ETH Bitcoin. There are some similarities, there's also some differences, and I really want to talk about it and also follow up on a prior video. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So Solana has been an interesting coin to follow for the last few years because it's actually one of the few altcoins that has outperformed Bitcoin at least since the beginning of 2023. Now, since 2021, it still is at a lower high, right? It's still at a lower high, but since 2022 ended, Solana has actually gone up against Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that you guys might remember me having said back in 2023 is that despite the fact that we were likely entering into a macro Bitcoin dominance uptrend, there would be a few altcoins that would outperform Bitcoin. Solana has been one of them. If you look actually at alt Bitcoin pairs, right, total 3 minus USCT divided by Bitcoin, if you look at this, you can see that since 2023 began, right here, alts have actually dropped against Bitcoin. And from that point, right, from January of 2023, all Bitcoin pairs are currently down 46%, which is very different than what Solana Bitcoin has done since the beginning of 2023, right? If you take it from this wick over here, it's actually up 328%, even though it's down a lot over the last year or so. But I wanted to talk about Solana Bitcoin. We've obviously made the comparisons to ETH Bitcoin before, so I want to continue on with that comparison. Talk about what are similarities, what are differences, and just kind of try to be objective, right? Try to be objective about it. Again, I don't always get things right, and certainly Solana Bitcoin is one that went against the Bitcoin dominance uptrend. But as I said, there's always a few that do, right? There's always a few that do. Now, the first thing you guys probably remember me talking about with Solana last year, about 5 months ago, I said that what would likely happen was that Sol Bitcoin would likely drop and then get a bounce back up in early 2025. So drop in Q4 and then go back up in early 2025. But that the key thing to look for would be whether it takes out the prior high or not. Now, you might be, confused as to why this chart right here looks a lot different than this one. And we're going to talk about, or not this one, but this one right here. And the difference is that this is the market cap of Solana divided by the market cap of Bitcoin, right? That's this chart. This chart is the price of Solana divided by the price of Bitcoin, right? So one of them is accounting for the supply, the other one's not, right? Market cap equals price times supply. The price, if you're just looking at it, as the supply changes, the market cap can change as well, because you're multiplying the price by the supply. So in this case, that's why that this chart looks different. It's because it is looking at the market cap ratio, and we're going to talk about that too. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is just the Bitcoin valuation of Solana and try to figure out, is it repeating Ethereum, just delayed by approximately 2 to 2.5 years. Now, I know videos like this are unfortunately just going to make a lot of people upset, a lot of people mad. You always have to remember that even if the view is correct that Solana follows ETH on its Bitcoin pair, that doesn't mean that Solana USD necessarily has to, go down. It's going to depend on what Bitcoin does, right? It would depend on what Bitcoin does. If Bitcoin goes up, right? I mean, if Bitcoin goes up, even if alts bleed against Bitcoin, you can still see that altcoin go up as long as Bitcoin's going up. It's the same thing that we've seen for Ethereum, right? For the last several years, right? If you look at ETH Bitcoin, we called for this collapse way back over here, right? When people don't really want to believe it. And now it's all the way down here. So the people that are now Solana maxis today, if you go back and listen to what they were saying back over here, they were all calling for the flippening. And now they've pivoted away from that, and they're actually focusing more on Solana now because Solana has outperformed Bitcoin for the last couple of years. But the pattern that I want to look at and sort of follow up on is this one, where if you look at the SOL Bitcoin price ratio, you can see that it dropped about 89% after its first major bull market. If you look at ETH Bitcoin, you'll also notice after its first major bull market, it also dropped about 89%, right? About the same amount. Now, what's interesting is that after ETH Bitcoin dropped 89%, it then rallied from that point 440%. Now, this is where the comparison is off a little, because if you look at SOL Bitcoin from the 89% drop, it actually rallied 554.3%, right? 500 instead of the 430 or so, which would have been like right here. It actually rallied up more. So one way to look at that is if you look at the fib retracement tool, SOL Bitcoin rallied up to the 618, whereas ETH Bitcoin only rallied up to the 0.5 fib retracement, right? If you look at that pretty closely, you can see what I'm talking about. ETH Bitcoin rallied up to the 0.5. SOL Bitcoin rallied up to the 618. And you can see that those levels have actually been somewhat, respected throughout the years, right? This is the 618, but that ended up, being that same level from back over here in March of 2022. And every time it comes down to these levels, right around 20,000 sats or so, it tends to stall out for a while. It doesn't really go anywhere. It's not breaking up, not breaking down. But one of the things that I mentioned, right, in this video is that you would likely see SOL Bitcoin drop and then get a bounce in early 2025 that would likely be to a lower high. And that's what I want to focus on right now. If you look at ETH Bitcoin, right, if you look at the ETH Bitcoin chart, what you'll see is that this high that was put in was a slightly higher high than the one that came after it. Now, the one that came after it was when the merge happened, right? If you guys remember, back in 2022, there was obviously a lot of discussion about the merge and how Ethereum was going to flip Bitcoin, but it ended up being a lower high compared to what it did previously. And ever since then, it then slowly came back down. Now, do you guys remember what happened as ETH Bitcoin was making this move, right? You had all sorts of meme coins launching and whatnot. And ultimately, what normally happens is we lose our way, right? Like the underlying asset can be good, right? I think Ethereum has a future, and I think Solana could also have a future. But if you've been in Solana for a long time and you haven't really been dabbling in the meme coins, you're probably wondering, right? Why has Solana like stalled out against Bitcoin at these levels? Well, if you think about it, all that meme coin mania for Solana started right around early 2024. I'm not saying there was nothing before it, but if memory serves me correct, that's when a lot of it started, was right in here. So what happens is, you have an asset that did a double bottom against Bitcoin, which was a good sign, and it was doing well, but then at some point we get distracted. And rather than focus on the underlying asset that's in the bull market, market participants then focus on frothier things like the meme coins. And so then what ends up happening is Solana, which I don't consider a meme coin, ends up stalling out on its Bitcoin pair because there's a misallocation of capital away from Solana into the meme coins that are running on Solana, right? So the capital gets misallocated. And because of that, it causes the SOL Bitcoin valuation to stall out and unable to go higher because there's, again, that misallocation of capital to meme coins and other things, and therefore Solana struggles to really make that next move. I'm not saying it can't, but it has been a struggle for a long time. Now, the key thing, though, we talked about, we said that like Solana would likely drop in Q4 on its Bitcoin pair and then bounce in early 2025. And the thing to look for would be, does it take out the prior high or not? So far, it has not, right? So far, you have the ETH Bitcoin rally into a lower high, just like you had at the merge. This one for Solana was a rally into a lower high right after President Trump launched a meme coin on Solana, right? It led to all this speculation in the short term, and then it just fell back again below the bull market support band. The other thing that we talked about to watch for in a video I did about maybe a month ago was watch to see if the Sol Bitcoin pair can actually get weekly closes up here. And so far it has not, right? This support level, this higher low support level ended up turning into resistance. Now this pattern is almost very similar to what ETH Bitcoin did. At this point, it's actually a weaker version of what ETH Bitcoin did. So if you look at ETH Bitcoin, you'll see the same pattern, right? It had a higher low structure, and in this phase, there was like this distribution phase up here that no one wanted to believe was a distribution phase. And it eventually broke down into a false low, right? A sort of a low that made a lot of people think the capitulation was already occurring. And then there was another bounce up into the merge. And then the bled began, right? So again, this low, right, because of the similarities between ETH Bitcoin and Solana Bitcoin, we said what would likely happen is that Solana Bitcoin would likely also follow that same path, where it's in this distribution phase up here, right? And then it'll break down here in Q4 of 2024 into a low that everyone thinks is the capitulation that's going to lead into a further drop. But in reality, we would get a bounce in early 2025. Now, I didn't know the reason for the bounce, but again, it's easy to find the narrative after it happens, right? And so what ended up happening was it was Trump launching a meme coin on Solana. You got a bounce, and then it's right back below these levels. Now, in this case, it's actually detouring a little bit away from what ETH Bitcoin did, because while ETH Bitcoin did put in a lower high on that rally, it stayed up there, and it actually got weekly closes up there, right, for a while, right? It got several weekly closes above that trend line, which Sol Bitcoin hasn't actually been able to do. Now, again, one of the reasons for that relative weakness of Solana Bitcoin now compared to ETH Bitcoin at the merge could just be due to simply the fact that when ETH Bitcoin got that initial rally, it only went up to the 0.5 fib retracement, right? It only went to the 0.5. If you take it from this peak, it obviously, the sort of the lower high that occurred later on, it was in fact the 618. But if you take it from that initial peak in June of 2017, it only went to the 0.5 fib retracement. Sol Bitcoin went to the 618, so it already went higher. That might explain some of that relative weakness. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that the narratives are strongest at extremes. So when you look at like the ETH Bitcoin chart, right? When you look at the ETH Bitcoin price ratio chart, it doesn't really necessarily look like this level right here is the same as this one. But when you look at the market cap ratio, you can see that they're very similar to each other, right? The highs from over here are not that different from the highs that ETH Bitcoin had in in 2022. So I think it's important to remember that the narratives are the hardest to fade at the extremes. When the merge happened, it was difficult for a lot of people to think that altcoins are oscillators at best. How many times have you heard me say that altcoins are oscillators at best? Look at the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio. This has bled for so long. Now, I've pointed this out that ETH Bitcoin would do this a long time ago, and now that I've started to post similar things about Solana, I'm getting some of the same types of criticism, right? And a lot of people are sort of saying, well, what about ETH? And I'm like, well, what about ETH? This is what we said was likely going to happen with ETH Bitcoin, was that it was likely going to bleed, especially until quantitative tightening returns. And you could argue that it's just been bleeding back down to the range lows over here, kind of proving the point that altcoins are, in fact, oscillators at best, right? So, at this extreme, no one really wanted to believe that ETH Bitcoin could go back down to the range lows, right, on its market cap valuation. It was not an easy task trying to convince people. And I think that it's going to be similar trying to convince people with Solana. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not going to make nearly as many videos about it, for two reasons. First of all, I don't really want to go through it again. I'll mention it maybe once or twice a year, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. I could be wrong, by the way, and there could be a couple pieces of evidence to suggest that it might not track ETH Bitcoin. One of the reasons could be due to the potential end of quantitative tightening. Um, you know, you could argue that if the Fed ends quantitative tightening, there's a chance that Sol Bitcoin does not have to follow the same path, right? You could argue that. What I mean is, if you look at like total assets held by the Federal Reserve and you overlay it with Sol Bitcoin, you can see that Solana was actually able to get this nice bounce despite the fact that quantitative tightening continued, even though the majority of altcoins did not get that same bounce. So you could argue that if QE returns, then maybe Solana Bitcoin does not have to follow the same path. The counterpoint, though, is when you look at the ETH Bitcoin market cap chart, it looks obvious today, right? It looks so obvious today that this was just a distribution phase, right? But again, good luck convincing people back in late 2021 and really mid 2022. Good luck convincing them of that, especially at the merge, that this was likely just going to bleed back down. You could argue that you didn't really need to know anything about monetary policy. You didn't need to know that the Fed was going to do quantitative tightening. All you needed to know was that altcoins are oscillators at best, and therefore, you would likely see ETH Bitcoin go back down. This is the market cap ratio, and it has. Today, the Solana Bitcoin price ratio is still well off the high from 2021, right? Well off the high, about 30 from that high there to this high here is still 33% down. The only way you can say Solana outperformed Bitcoin was if you like basically say, well, if you bought Solana at the bottom, then yes, it has. But there's always some that do. Today, it's still about 55% down against Bitcoin. Now, here's the thing. The Solana Bitcoin chart kind of looks like the ETH Bitcoin market cap chart, right? This chart and this chart. Because you could argue that this is the same thing, right? Who's to say that it's not just doing the same exact thing? Because this is what ETH Bitcoin did, right? It had an initial run up as well. And then eventually it got into this range up here. And then this, and if you look at the market cap chart, right, this is what it looked like. But I mean, if we had the chart history going back before 2017 on ETH market cap divided by Bitcoin market cap, right, if it went back all the way to like 2015, 2016, you would also see something similar, right? The ETH Bitcoin market cap valuation would have been like way down here, and then it would have come up into that range, right? It would have been like way down here at some point. That's the initial capitalization of the project, right? And then it becomes this oscillator against Bitcoin at best. And so you can see pretty clearly, it looks so obvious on the chart today that ETH Bitcoin was in fact oscillating. The market cap ratio was in fact oscillating at best after its initial capitalization. It tends to top out up here. It had a spike way up there, right? But if you just look at say like the weekly close, right, 0.61, 0.49, this weekly close right there was 0.47. And then over here in this bull market for ETH Bitcoin, it topped out around 0.52, 0.53, which is right in between where it topped out in the prior cycle, right? And then it bottomed out. It had a bottom there at 0.13 and then as low as 0.1. So far, this has gone as low as around 0.14, right? So it's getting pretty close to what the historical lows were in the prior cycle, right? It's not that far off. Now, right now, the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio is 0.17, but you can kind of see that it topped out when it reaches around half of Bitcoin's market cap. When ETH reaches half of Bitcoin's market cap, that's when it topped out, and it bottomed out when it reached about 1/10 of Bitcoin's market cap, which is not that far off from where it's already gone today. So then if you look at the Solana Bitcoin pair, on the market cap ratio, you can see that last cycle in 2021, it topped out at a market cap ratio of 0.07. So 7%. And this cycle, so far, it went as high as 0.07. And then this spike right here was also 0.07. So the SOL Bitcoin market cap ratio keeps topping out at around 7%. And every time it goes up there, everyone then calls for Solana to flip Bitcoin, or for it to flip Ethereum. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but what I'm saying, like Ethereum, the narratives become the strongest when the alt Bitcoin market cap ratio is at an extreme, right? That's when you think it's going to flip Bitcoin. And then what happens is, the project's doing really, really well throughout this phase, and everyone in Solana's making a lot of money. And then as you get up into this phase, people lose their way. And then they start focusing on meme coins on Solana rather than Solana itself, right? And so I think the argument is that there should be more to the industry than meme coins. So I'm not suggesting that Solana doesn't have a future, right? What I'm suggesting is that when you do get a lot of malinvestment, a lot of the misallocation of capital in a project to things that shouldn't be allocated in, when we lose our way, what tends to happen is the market punishes investors until they course correct, right? And that the same thing, by the way, happened with Ethereum, right? We lost our way. And then this happened. Fortunately, we called for this collapse on this channel back in 2022. We said that ETH Bitcoin is likely going to drop a lot. And it might not bottom until quantitative tightening ends. So now if you look at SOL Bitcoin, I just wonder, right? I mean, are we just sitting at extremes up here and everyone's like hoping it goes higher, but one of the reasons it doesn't is because it's at the range high against Bitcoin, and there's been this massive misallocation of capital away from Solana, away from, say, like, utility and actual projects that provide value, to just what influencer can launch the newest meme coin and grift it to as high of a market cap as they can before they dump on all of their followers, right? And so that's what it's turned into. And so this is why the chart looks like that. So where I could be wrong is a couple of things where I could be wrong. Number one is, if you look at monetary policy, we have not had the pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So whenever that pivot comes, I wouldn't be that surprised to see SOL Bitcoin get a big bounce. The question is does it actually take out the prior high or not? Now, there are cases where you can find an altcoin that looks like it's going to do this pattern, where it provides sort of like a massive distribution phase where it gets rejected at a prior high and then goes down. And then what ends up happening is you get like a fake out above it, only for it to then drop. So let me show you what I'm talking about, right? So if you go look at, let me go look over here. So if you go look at INJ Bitcoin, this is not the market cap ratio. This is just the price ratio. But if you look at this is a good example where you had sort of a range here. And you could have argued, right? You could have argued that it would top out around that same level. And I think the history will probably remember it as having done something like that. But there was this fake out sort of above that range right there. And then it came back down. Now in the short term, maybe it's just coming back down to that structure right there. But the point is that sometimes it'll wick above it, or more than just a wick, only for it to then bleed. It'll sort of rinse all those traders out. Even though they're right that it would bleed, right, when it was at 5,000 sats or 4,700 sats, they were right that a year later it would be a lot lower, right, down to 1,500 sats. So this thing has dropped, a lot. I mean, it's more than halved since then. I mean, from a percentile basis from that level, INJ Bitcoin is down 68%. It didn't stop it from getting this move up right there before then bleeding back down into that level. So I don't want to suggest that it's like impossible for something like that to happen. it is possible. One of the other common things that people are talking about is the launch of a potential Solana ETF, which could also make things or change the game. But I would push back on that a little bit, because the launch of the Ethereum ETF was, right around here. And you can see that, yeah, I mean, it led to a nice rally. And a lot of people said I was wrong about ETH Bitcoin continuing to bleed, but it ended up just being another lower high. And people just didn't really want to believe it. And now you can see that no one believes this stuff anymore. No one really believes in the lower highs. And I think ETH Bitcoin is just going full out into outright capitulation, and could very well try to find support down here. Just like if my views about Solana Bitcoin are correct and that it's potentially following ETH Bitcoin, it doesn't even mean it has to die if it follows this. It could just be a painful process where allocation of capital has to become better, and we have to focus on what actually matters so that then it can find support and go back up. Now, my guess is that if it is to follow ETH Bitcoin, it would take place over the next couple of years, right? It's not going to just go down here tomorrow, more than likely. What would likely happen is, it'd probably range up here for a little while, do something like that, maybe get a nice little bounce like that later on, and then by sort of like the end of 2026, maybe you would find the Sol Bitcoin valuation back down at the range lows, only to then perhaps go back up again the following cycle. And it will be sort of the misallocation of capital up here that caused the Solana Bitcoin valuation to go back down to the range lows, right? The focus on meme coins. One interesting way to look at the market is to look at the ETH Bitcoin chart and take a bar pattern, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a bar pattern and copy that. So we're just going to copy it, and then we're going to overlay it on the Solana Bitcoin chart. So we're going to overlay it on a log scale. And what you'll notice is that it's eerily similar, right? Like it's really similar to the chart. If you take it from sort of the highs and you just make it sort of over the same time frame, you can see that there are a lot of similarities. In fact, I mean, ETH Bitcoin, the yellow line, had this double bottom, right? Sol Bitcoin had that double bottom. They both went up into this distribution, right? And now it just seems like it's slowly bleeding back down. So the point that I'm trying to make is that even if Sol Bitcoin does drop over the next couple of years, it's going to take probably half a year for people to even recognize it, right? Because if it follows this path, it could still be at, 16,000 sats 6 months from now, potentially, if it follows what ETH Bitcoin did, right? It would take a lot longer to reach less than 10,000 sats, right? It wouldn't reach that level if it follows ETH Bitcoin, not until, say, like the end or middle or the beginning to middle part of 2026. So, I think there's this other thing that's bothered me for a while, and that's the alt Bitcoin chart, right? If you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, they haven't gone back down to the range lows yet, even though I do think they will. But one of the ways that they could go back down there is if some of the larger altcoins that have done well against Bitcoin were to give back some of those gains, which is what Solana Bitcoin has done recently. It's given back some of those gains, and it's allowed alt Bitcoin pairs to go lower. You might say, well, this Ethereum has gone lower. That's why this is going lower. No, total 3 does not include ETH, right? So Sol Bitcoin is included in this chart, and if you overlay Sol Bitcoin onto this chart, what you'll notice is that alt Bitcoin pairs, right? They were doing okay here as Sol Bitcoin was going up a lot, right? But ever since Sol Bitcoin started to then slowly bleed, alt Bitcoin pairs collectively have been bleeding, right? So that's why I think it's relevant to talk about this stuff. Again, I got into I don't know how many debates with ETH maxis back in 2022 when I was, trying to preach about Bitcoin dominance, about why I was wrong about it and everything, and how the merge was going to change everything. And here it is today, and the market cap ratio is at 0.17. It already went to 0.14, which is not that far off from prior lows in this market cap ratio of 0.1 and 0.13, right? So now no one's really arguing against it. Now people are just hoping that it bottoms. And now people are sort of desperate for quantitative easing to come back in to hopefully see ETH Bitcoin, really bottom out and start to go back up. But again, there's a narrative for everything, right? So I get the sense that, posting videos like this, even though I'm trying to remain objective, and I'm open-minded to being wrong, right? I've been wrong about plenty of things. I certainly don't get everything right. I get things wrong all the time. In fact, Solana Bitcoin vastly outperformed what I thought it was going to be able to do. I mean, I said that I thought some alts would outperform Bitcoin, but it's always hard to know which ones, right? And Solana did really, really well, right? It has. And I honestly think that maybe that is, a good omen for Solana in the future. But that doesn't mean that there can't be misallocation of capital for periods of time that cause it to stall out on its Bitcoin pair and go back down. So I guess I'll make some enemies from a video like this, which is what normally happens. When I post a video, even though I was bullish on XRP Bitcoin at like 600, 700 sats, and then I made a video saying it was in like the 0.8 to 0.9 risk level, then people came out and sort of talk trash. So no matter what you do when you talk about an altcoin, you're going to make enemies, right? You're going to make enemies because there's obviously a lot of people that are really focused on that cryptocurrency and want it to do well. And just as a reminder, right? Just as a reminder, ETH Bitcoin. I said this earlier, right? But even though, right, if you look at ETH USD, right, if you overlay ETH USD onto this chart, even though ETH Bitcoin has dropped, ETH USD has gone up, right? So it's kind of like a consolation prize for the ETH maxis. It's not like their net worth went down by just buying Ethereum for the last few years. They've actually made money. It's just they made a lot less money than had they just bought Bitcoin, right? So when you look at like a Sol Bitcoin chart, even if it does go down, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Sol USD valuation has to follow suit. Sol USD could go up if Bitcoin goes up, right? That's the idea, right? It could still go up if Bitcoin goes up. If Bitcoin goes down, then Sol USD would likely go down. But to me, it's really hard to look at a chart like this and not think that it's just some type of macro distribution phase. Just like ETH Bitcoin had once upon a time. And it's hard because, you talk a lot about it and it seems so obvious, but it takes so long to play out, right? When ETH Bitcoin came into this range in May of 2021, it took really, until it fell below that range low right there, it took 2 to 2.5 years before it fell below it, right? This is 135 weeks, right? So if you were to look at Sol Bitcoin when it first came up into that range right there, and you were to take a date range on this, it's only been 60 weeks, right? So that's actually still half the amount of time, right? That's actually around sort of this time, right? As it broke down, right? As it broke down and then broke back up. That's exactly where Sol Bitcoin is today, right? It just broke down. It just broke down right here. And then it went back up. So the breakdown from when it first came into that range occurred 51 weeks later. Now, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, right? If you look at the ETH Bitcoin chart and say, well, when did it break down after it first got up into that range from this level right, or sorry, let me get a date range on this. From this level right here, it's about the same, right? About 50 weeks or so, right? So you have Sol Bitcoin like 51 weeks, ETH Bitcoin about 54 weeks. And if you take it from the actual high that was initially set before it got a correction until it first got that breakdown, it was right around 51, 52, 53 weeks, right? Around the same exact thing that Sol Bitcoin did, right? So then again, who's to say that the chart won't look like this, where it then just slowly bleeds? And one way that it could do it is that people keep hoping for more, that more utility, more this, more that, and all they really get is influencers just launching more and more meme coins. And that's how you could see a chart like ETH Bitcoin take hold, is that the market realizes that this is the only thing that's going to happen, um, and something has to change before it goes back up. So we'll see, guys. Again, I know this isn't going to be a popular video, and I actually do think, I do think that Solana has done really, really well against Bitcoin, and the fact that it's made it back up to the range highs could bode well for it in the future. Whether it means coming back down and then going back up again, or maybe it sweeps the high one more time. But it's hard when you think about sort of like the fact that it has stalled out here for so long. It just looks like what ETH Bitcoin did once upon a time. The only difference is that it's 2.5 years delayed, right? The low here for ETH Bitcoin was June of 2022. For Sol Bitcoin, this low here was December of 2024. So it's exactly 2.5 years behind. If ETH Bitcoin were to bottom out soon, I don't know when, but soon, or not. I mean, maybe it just keeps on bleeding. I don't know. But 2.5 years after that low for Sol Bitcoin, right? So that gets you to December 2025, December 2026. That'd be about mid 2027, for it to then bottom out. The reason why that's interesting is because a lot of cycles we sort of mimic the cycle from 2 cycles ago. And what you guys might remember is that 2 cycles ago, Bitcoin dominance actually topped in 2019, right? In about mid 2019, in fact. Right? This chart doesn't show it, but if you look at like the ETH Bitcoin chart, right? If we overlay Bitcoin dominance onto this chart, right? Bitcoin dominance topped in mid 2019 in 2 cycles ago. So what if you see something similar happen where dominance for the next cycle tops mid 2027, kind of like mid 2019, and then you have Sol Bitcoin bottoming out 2.5 years after that low, which would put you in mid 2027. I know it's crazy thought, but it wouldn't be like the worst. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily the least likely outcome, where it just kind of stays up in this range for a while, slowly bleeds down. Everyone thinks it's dead out here in 2027, and then finally all the meme coin stuff, all the meme coin froth is taken out, and then hopefully there can be something real, more real stuff built, and then it goes back up. And then you basically just get the ebb and flow of the Cryptoverse, right? So I think that those are my opinions on Solana Bitcoin, and we'll see if it pans out. I'm just trying to remain objective, just like I was for ETH Bitcoin. I was right about ETH Bitcoin. I could be wrong about Sol Bitcoin. Maybe I'm missing something. If I am, feel free to tell me in the comments. What am I missing? Why is it different than ETH Bitcoin 2.5 years ago? What makes Sol Bitcoin different today? Are we just relying on the ETFs for Solana? Because ETH got that and it didn't change anything. Are we relying on QE? Okay. When's that going to happen, right? I don't know. Probably not until all Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows. But you could argue that in order for all Bitcoin pairs to go to the range lows, Sol Bitcoin would need to drop some to allow the altcoin market to go to the range lows against Bitcoin. So again, it's like the chicken and the egg, right? In order to get what you need, you have to go where you don't want to go. Not get what you need, get what you want, right? And in order to get what you want, the alt Bitcoin pairs have to go where people don't want them to go. But the only way for them to go there is for some of the higher market cap alts to show that weakness. And I mean, it certainly seems like Sol Bitcoin had sort of a higher low structure, and then it came back down, rallied up to it, and then was rejected. That doesn't mean it can't rally back up to it again and get rejected. Maybe it does. But again, I'm probably not going to make another video on this topic for half a year, because so much stuff can happen in the short term. I remember when I talked about this stuff a long time ago for ETH Bitcoin, And it took so long, right? I mean, I talked about it here, and in the short term, there was a massive drop, and then it rallied, and then a drop, and then it rallied. I mean, it took so long for it to do anything. Um, so you can understand why it's not really worth talking about every few weeks. But the last video I made specifically on Sol Bitcoin was like 5 months ago. So perhaps the next one I'll make on Sol Bitcoin might be half a year from now, and we'll see. We'll see if it's following this path that ETH Bitcoin did, or if it's doing something different. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. But again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.